Well, hello. Hello, hello. I think I'm going to start. Um, Thank you all very much for coming this evening, and we're delighted to see so many here. First of all, just can I say that we are recording this Zoom meeting, the Zoom presentation. So if you don't want to be recorded, I'm afraid you just have to go, I think. But the other option for you is to watch it later on YouTube. We are delighted that William Fagan has agreed to give this lovely presentation. It's a subject very close to our hearts at the moment. We are in the Gallery of Photography. We're working very hard on the first major survey of the history of photography in Ireland. So this very series of exhibitions will unfold from November this year and over the course of next year. And as part of that project, with the very grateful to receive funding from the Heritage Council, we're designing an interactive history of photography timeline to appear on our website. So more about that when it gets launched later this year. But for the moment, we thought we might whet your appetite. And so first of all, before I introduce William, I'd love to thank very much the Heritage Council, and I hope you're all enjoying the Heritage Week activities. Also, the Arts Council are our main sponsor, and we're always grateful for their support. William has joined the board of the Gallery of Photography recently, and he is an absolute trooper. And he's got infectious enthusiasm and a vast amount of knowledge. And there's a short biography of him in the various promo about this talk, so I won't go into it again. But suffice to say that he is also a star of the internet and of the social media circuit, since buying a camera, an old Leica camera, and finding in it a roll of film, developing that film and becoming, in fact, an overnight sensation, with the whole world, it seems, looking for the people, trying to identify the people that were in the photographs that he found. So, Willie, you're a great star, and thank you so much for all your work here for the gallery, and also I'm so looking forward to your presentation. Could I say to everybody, please keep your mics muted, but by all means, if you think of a question, you may put it in the chat, and we hope to come to that later on. So over to you, William.
Thanks very much, Tanya. You'll have me embarrassed, an overnight star at my age. The next stop, by the way, for that story is Hollywood. I'll tell you the story, full story, and I hope that my producer is online. I have a tall task here tonight to talk about Irish photography since 1839. That's 182 years, according to my maths. A lot has happened in photography since then, and a lot has happened in Ireland. This is about photography, not photographers per se, but Irish photographers will feature here. So long as a photograph has a connection to Ireland of some kind, it might appear here. And I'm going to say at the outset, these are my own personal choice, but however, it doesn't reflect all the photographs I would like to show. I have a lot of friends who are photographers, and I would love to show their work here. But it just simply, I have about 50 images to show to cover 180 years. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to pay tribute to a man called Eddie Chandler. I know there's a few members of the Dublin Camera Club who are on at the moment. Eddie Chandler I first met in the Dublin Camera Club about 40 years ago. He was a man of immense knowledge about the history of Irish photography, particularly about the 19th century. Here I'm showing the catalogue of an exhibition which he held in the Guinness Museum in 1989, which is 32 years ago. And Eddie And Peter Walsh was also involved in this, but Eddie he was like an encyclopedia when it came to the history of photography in Ireland. And a lot of the names you're going to hear mentioned tonight, I first heard from Eddie. To begin at the beginning, to misappropriate Dylan Thomas, Nicéphore Niepce is accredited with the first permanent photographic image in the mid-1820s. I'm taking this little trip to France because it'll lead me back to 1839, which is why did you start from there? This is mid-1820s. For many years, a thing called a camera obscura, which means a dark room, was used by painters and others in order to draw and to paint. But nobody could hold on to that image and fix it until our friend came along in the mid-1820s. He died in 1833, and his son Isidore took up with a man called Louis Daguerre, whose name may be familiar to those who know a bit about the history of photography. And Daguerre created this process, and I'm not going to go into technical details tonight. I apologize to all the experts. We might do a timeline, or I might do another talk on the changes in photographic technology. But tonight I'm just going to stick with just mentioning these things as we go by. This photograph here, a daguerreotype on the Boulevard du Temple in Paris in 1838, is probably the very first photographic image of a human being. And the reason why this man is in the image is because he was having his shoes shined. All the other people on the street were moving, and therefore they didn't register, because this would have taken many, many minutes to actually create this image. However, the following year, the French government did a remarkable thing, and all Francophiles should cheer at this. They made a free gift to the world of the daguerreotype process, and they paid pensions to Niepce Jr. and to our friend Louis Daguerre. However, just before that happened, Daguerre sold a license to a man called Richard Beard, which applied to England and Wales, not to Ireland or to Scotland. Copyright laws were different. So that brings me on to my next piece. Who was the first Irish person to be photographed? Now, technically, Maria Edgeworth, the author, was not Irish. She was born in England, but we regard her as Irish. And there's even a town called Edgeworthstown named after her. She had a daguerreotype taken of her at Beard's studio, which was in Regent Street in London, on the top of what is now the Polytechnic, which is an institution which has taught photography for many years. And I just thought, and this is the only thing I'm actually going to read tonight, is to take her own words. She was an author. She was 73 years of age. Here was her description of being photographed at Mr. Beard's place. And we all had our likenesses taken. It is a wonderful, mysterious operation. You are taken from one room into another, upstairs and down, and you see various people whispering and hear them in neighboring passages and rooms unseen, and the whole apparatus and stool on high platform under a glass dome, casting a snapdragon blue light, making all look like specters, and the men in black gliding about. So there you had somebody who was actually born in the 18th century in 1841, describing what it was like to have your photograph taken. Just one other comment before I move on to the next slide is that at around this time, Paul Delaroche, the French painter, when he saw his first daguerreotype, said, "From today, painting is dead." Remember those words because I'll come back to them. Now, the first photographic studio in Dublin is said to have been on the top of the rotunda. And I recall Eddie Chandler describing this and the glass enclosure about 40 years ago. There's a lot of debate about who opened it. Was it Beard? Was it Francis Stuart Beatty from Northern Ireland? Was it Dusan de Bry, the Frenchman? Or was it our friend Gluckman, who was probably Hungarian and not German, as some people think? There is a later photograph from 1846 taken by Calvert Jones of the Rotunda building, and this doesn't appear. But I heard today from somebody who heard from somebody in the OPW that this this had been taken down before 1846. However, this was the start, because all down O'Connell Street, across the bridge into Westmoreland Street, cross up into Grafton Street, we had what became known as the Photographer's Mile. And this is where a lot of the studio photographers ply their wear. Now, speaking of O'Connell Street, we might as well deal with the man himself, Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell here appears here in a lithograph. With a daguerreotype, you only had the metal plate, you could not make copies. So here you had the liberator himself in the form of a lithograph, so the copies could be made for as many hundreds of thousands of supporters, and it was probably produced for sale. This was either done by Beard or by Gluckman. The problem about reproduction was in partial way resolved by a man in England called William Fox Talbot, who created a process called the calotype process, which involved a paper negative. Again, I won't go into the details. This photograph taken at his place in Laycock Abbey was taken around 1844. In fact, it says here April 1844, so in April 1844. And the Irish connection here is the little man in the tall hat. That is Thomas Moore, our national poet, who actually had a house and was in Laycock and was a neighbor of Fox Talbot. So did the calotype process come to Dublin? Yes, it did. This photograph here of Hardwick Street Church, Hardwick Place Church, is probably the world's first wedding photograph. So it has a lot to answer for. The processes were not perfect in those days. Here you'll see probably the bridegroom, this large chap here. And over here, you'll see him before he had come over here. So he'd stood there for a while and was registered on the image. It's not clear who took this. Could be Fox Talbot, could be Calvert Jones, could be one of Brewster's disciples from Scotland. But the picture exists. We'll go back to daguerreotypes for a second. Here's a famous photograph taken in Kilmainham jail. And this was taken by Gluckman, who probably bribed his way in, because there's the jailer with his key, and there is the soldier with his gun. You have William Smith O'Brien and Thomas Francis Marr, two of the young Irish rebel leaders, although they're very elegant looking rebels. He had intended to make a lithograph, but because of the nature of the composition, he wasn't able to do this. So he actually had to, Gluckman had to employ someone to draw the images from his photograph and then do the lithographs. I saw one recently in Waterford in the Granville Hotel, in the place where Thomas Francis Marr was born. Going on a few years to the early 1850s, you will immediately see in this image here that the image quality is improving. This is also a calotype, but you can see the individual bricks on the building. This is St. Dulac's Church near Malahide. And you'll also see a gentleman with a tall hat here. John Shaw Smith is a man who should be better known. He was one of our very famous early photographers here in Ireland. I just want to, before we leave this image, as well as I paid tribute earlier to Eddie Chandler, to Sean McCrum and Paddy Salmon, two friends of mine, who were responsible for having the PSI collection, including these, put into the National Archive, and also for disseminating the fame of John Shaw Smith. And this unusual photograph, which was obviously not taken in Ireland, was probably the first Irish holiday snap. This was taken in Piraeus in Greece, near Athens, around 11 a.m. on Friday, the 17th of October, 1851. Now, the cameras in those days didn't record times like the digital cameras of today. In this particular case, John Shaw Smith's wife, Mary, kept a diary, and she wrote into it where, when, and how all the different photographs were taken. This man here probably would have held this pose for about 5 minutes, so it probably required a lot of drachmas or whatever they were in those days to bribe him to sit there in the heat. Over here, I have friends of a friend in Greece are actually working on this. There's something about soldiers and philosophers in this. And let everybody know when they work out what it means. Around 1851, a new process came in, and Scott Archer, who was a sculptor himself, created the wet plate collodion process. Then this led to various further uses of photography. And one of the big fads of the day were things called carte de visite, which you could have your image made on a little visiting card. I recall Eddie Chandler talking about these. He had one of the largest collections of carte de visite in the country, and I believe that they are somewhere in the National Photographic Archive at the moment. So if when you went to somebody's house, you handed them this, if you wanted them to remember you. The man in this particular photograph is a man who should be alive today with all this COP stuff and happening. He was an Irish scientist called John Tyndall, who predicted the greenhouse effect. Another fad of the day was stereo photography. Here we have an example from William Despard Hemphill from Clonmel, and he produced a book of photographs of Clonmel and its environs. Now, for stereo photography, you needed two images, not both exactly the same, but when they're put together, they give you a 3D effect. And this was either achieved by having two lenses or having a sliding lens. He was nearly the very first person in the world to have a stereo photography book out, and there would be glasses with it so that you could view the images. But a man called Piazzi Smith, who was an astronomer working on Tenerife, beat him to it with images of Tenerife because he had a shorter book. Another stereo image here, and a famous story about a Dublin photographer called James Robinson. And it's a story which features the death of Chatterton, which was a famous painting of that time. Now, what he did was he saw the death of Chatterton painting, which was by a man called Henry Wallace, on display in Dublin, and people were paying a shilling to see it. So Robinson said, I'll have some of that. So he created a stereo image and colored the photographs. Chatterton was, just to tell you who he was a youth from the 18th century who had been caught forging medieval poems. And when he was caught, he committed suicide. So this was a very, very, very famous image of its day. Now, what had happened, though, was that Wallace had sold the painting to another painter whose name was, believe it or not, Augustus Egg. And Augustus Egg then sold the rights of that, the reproduction rights of that, to a man called Turner. Turner then sued Robinson to stop him from circulating this image, and he was stopped. Later on, when the market in dead Chattertons had kind of collapsed, what happened then was other painters, photographers from England, such as Michael Burr, started to put out their own copies. Now, I've shown an image of a woman where there were women photographers around. Well, there was Mary Ross, who was the wife of the Earl of Ross, William Parsons. Her husband had built the world's largest telescope in the 1840s. And Mary Ross was an excellent photographer. Her darkroom is still down in Burke Castle and is well worth seeing. She was adept at all types, calotype, glass plate, you name it. This is a photograph of her sons, two of her sons, I think it's Randall and Claire. And this little divil down here is Charles Parsons, who became Sir Charles Parsons, the inventor of the steam turbine. This lady here was a Miss Knox, who was their nanny or their mistress. Now, before I describe these hirsute gentlemen here, the Dublin Photographic Society, officers and council, 1856, I just want to mention that they had some female members, and one of them was Mary Ross, and she won their first silver medal for paper negatives in 1859. Now, as I say, this group are meeting in Leinster House, which was then the headquarters of the Royal Dublin Society, the RDS. I will mention the RDS again a few times as we go along. And they were all gentlemen, as you will see, people of, as it were, with a few bob in their pockets. This is Sir John Jocelyn Coghill, who was the president at the time. This is Lord Otto Fitzgerald. This is a painter called Michelangelo Hayes. What a great name for a painter. And this man here, to the right of John Jocelyn Coghill, but to his left, as we look on it, is a man called Thomas Grubb. And I want to say a few things about Thomas Grubb. But before I do, it was Thomas Grubb who assisted the Earl of Ross with building the mirror for his telescope. And the remarkable thing is that the blacksmithing for that was done by Mary Ross. Now, here's my collection of brass lenses made by Thomas and Howard Grubb in Dublin from the 1850s to the 1880s. Thomas Grubb, his day job was as chief engineer of the Bank of Ireland, but he also had an iron works and also eventually an optical works. And these lenses here, he created his own design called the Aplanatic, for which he got a patent. He got resisted from Britain, particularly by a man called Thomas Sutton, who described himself as the wrangler from Cambridge, i.e. he had a first-class honours degree in maths from Cambridge, and he kind of looked down on Grubb, who didn't have such a thing. And in fact, in the Photographic Journal, he made a lot of disparaging comments about anything that came from the Green Isle. These are marvelous lenses. I've actually used them, and they produce marvelous image quality. But he didn't really stay in this business because he was so successful with his telescopes, with the great Melbourne telescope, and indeed built many of the observatories which are around the world, including the one in Vienna. How good were these lenses? Well, the next image will tell you. Now, this is an image not taken in Ireland, and not taken by an Irish person, but it was taken with an Irish eye, i.e. a lens made in Rathmines. And these are the photographs taken by Carlton Watkins in Yosemite in the 1860s, many years before Ansel Adams was born. And when Abraham Lincoln saw these pictures, he was so impressed that he made this the first national park in the whole world. So Irish photographic technology was having an impact at the highest levels. Coming back to Ireland, the last photograph I showed you from Carlton Watkins would have been taken from the top of a mountain, and he would have needed a large van to process his wet plates. With wet plate photography, you put on the collodion and the silver nitrate, I'm simplifying it here, and within 15 minutes you have to expose it, and then very quickly afterwards you have to develop it. Otherwise everything is gone. So these people here, the Dillon family from Clonbrock House near Ahascraw in Galway, built their own photograph house so as they could pose in front of the house and then have their photographs processed inside in a matter of minutes. This is very typical of what is known in Ireland as big house photography, because in those days you had to be wealthy and you had to have an education to do photography. So this was the feature of the day. Photography wasn't there, as it were, at that time for the ordinary man or woman. Now, a man called Richard Maddox created a thing called the dry plate in 1871. And this led to a lot of things being possible that weren't possible before. With the dry plate, it could be developed at the photographer's ease. So therefore, you didn't have to go rushing for a lab or for a darkroom to develop it immediately afterwards. This photograph is one of the Lawrence collection. It's of the quays in Cork, showing the old Cork City Hall, which was burnt down by the British in 1920. This was originally thought to be from 1902, but the National Photographic Archive do a wonderful thing on Flickr's Common, in which they put out images and ask for comments. And Ireland is full of people who know the history of Ireland, the history of photography, and they get marvelous responses. One chap came back and said, you see this poster here on the wall here on the right? That was for a minstrel show, which moved from Dublin to Cork in April 1883. And that's how this particular photograph was actually dated. So I just want to say, if there are people here from local history groups, from heritage groups, from camera clubs, have a look at the Wikimedia Commons of the NLI archives. You may be able to contribute something to discovering our photographic history. Now to a remarkable set of photographs. These photographs were probably taken by a man called Henry Morgan for the Pall Mall Gazette. These were at the evictions in Bodyke in Clare in June 1887. Just to explain to people who are not from Ireland that at that time there was a land war going on between landlords, a lot of whom were absentee, and the tenants, a lot of whom had fallen on hard times over rents. And then there was a series of evictions in which the police and the army and everybody would turn out, and they would evict the people and then destroy their houses so as they couldn't move back into them. Well, there was resistance everywhere, particularly in Bodyke. In Bodyke, this image here in the middle is probably either Colonel O'Callaghan, who was the landlord, or his man, his bailiff, who actually was struck with an epileptic fit while he was trying to evict the people. Now, the remarkable thing about this particular photograph here is the way the people are staring into the camera with determination. This is 20th century stuff to me, not 19th century stuff, almost like Cartier-Bresson or somebody had taken it. You're talking about a man going out, and these people were, to an extent, posing, but they weren't posing in the usual Victorian way. And there's something around the neck, something like, praise the Lord, for the tyrant's arm was paralyzed, or something like that. Another one from the same series. These are the O'Halloran sisters. And this is also remarkable, the way they're looking straight into the camera with determination. You can see the freckles on this young lady's face, and you can see the mischief on this young woman's face. They were involved in the resistance. They poured boiling water on top of the bailiffs and actually went to prison for it. But here was the beginnings of what I call photojournalism, made possible by the dry plate and by obviously a remarkable photographer who took these, notwithstanding the cropping. Now, there's been a lot of debate here in Ireland, and I've seen PhD theses written on it, about why there are no photographs of the famine and whether or not it was one class didn't ever bother looking at the other class. A lot of it from the 1840s was to do with time, like the issue with the wedding group and movement and recording people. This was taken later on in the 1880s and 1890s by a man called Leland Lewis Duncan on a walk from Big House. He was staying at Annadale House in Kiltubrid near Mohall. And he went out on a walk one day and he saw this scene and recorded this. Most of his other photographs are of people sitting around on the lawn and all the usual big house photography. He was actually an official in the War Office and received an OBE for his service to local history, which is what he took up when he retired. His great-grandfather had been the governor of the Bank of Ireland, and he was staying, the people in Annandale House were his cousins. Now into the 1890s, just a few little comments about the Irish literary movement and photography. John Millington Synge was on the Ireland Islands. He may have been recuperating. He had a lot of illness in his life. And he met an English tourist with a plate camera, which he bought. He subsequently got a multiple plate camera, and I have an example of one of those myself that was sold in Belfast. Here, he's recording the life of the people here, which was quite different to that of the people on the mainland and their culture and their clothing. Other people have been there before, such as Jane Shackleton. But the reason why I'm showing Synge's pictures here is because I want to mention that photography also got into Irish culture to other people in the literary movement. Joyce, for example, made Molly Bloom's niece, Millie Bloom, a photographer's apprentice from Mullingar. And then, of course, there was George Bernard Shaw, who not only wrote about photography, but George Bernard Shaw was also a photographer himself. And he had a wonderful aphorism, which was that a photographer was like a salmon that lays 1,000,000 eggs so that one might turn out right. He must have known something about digital photography coming down the line. Another one that I recall Eddie Chandler standing there telling us about 40 years ago was John Joly. John Joly was a polymath, a genius. He experimented with all kinds of things, and a lot of it was very successful, including the use of radium for the treatment of cancer. He was a bigwig in the RDS, and then he created his own color photography process. It's rather complicated. It involves taking what is essentially a black and white photograph through red, green, and blue filters, and then displaying it back through those filters. It wasn't a huge success. The Lumiere brothers autochrome process was more successful, but they have some of these original plates in the RDS, and they actually have a viewer to go and see it. I hope the people from the RDS are on tonight. I'm showing this picture. It's not a great picture, and there's a lot of blur and subject movement in it to show the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. 1900, Queen Victoria, arriving in what was then known as Kingstown, Dundee, to show the massive crowds that were there to welcome her. Just to say that in Queen Victoria's time, we had the whole of photography I've described so far. She took the throne in 1837. And she actually espoused a lot of the fads, such as the carte de visite and stereo photography. The reason why I'm showing this is because I'm going to do a matchup later on with the Eucharistic Congress, because this was probably the biggest crowd between this time and the Eucharistic Congress. Says something. Moving on 12 years to 1912, aboard the Titanic. This photograph here is not only the last photograph of the wireless room on the Titanic, it is probably the only photograph of the wireless room on the Titanic. It was taken by a Jesuit priest, Father Frank Brown. Frank had traveled over from Southampton to Queenstown. It's interesting to be Kingstown there a minute ago, which is now known as Cove, on the first leg of its fateful journey of the Titanic. While he was on the boat, a young American couple came up to him and said, "You're a lovely Irish priest. How would you like free tickets?" They said they would buy tickets for him to go on to America. He asked the superiors in the Jesuits, and they said, "Get off that boat." So I'm still wondering to this day, what did the Jesuits know about what was going to happen to the Titanic? These photographs went around the world at the time because they were the only photographs of that voyage, because he was the one with the camera, and he got off at Cove and he didn't go down with the ship. Kodak were so pleased because he used Kodak film that they gave him a lifetime supply of Kodak film. Lucky him. Now, a few years later, we have World War I. This is Jimmy Scott from Belfast. He was an experienced soldier, but he was being retrained again with the Royal Irish Rifles, which had come from what was known as the Young Citizen Volunteers, although he was a little bit more than a young citizen himself at this stage. He's a great-grandfather of a friend of mine from Belfast. I hope he's on tonight, Mark Scott, who wrote a book called The Man Who Shot the Great War. And it's not Jimmy Scott, who died at Thiepval, unfortunately, in 1917, but a man called George Hackney, who I'll show you now. Now, these two hippies here, this photograph was taken around January 1916 at the front. They're wearing goatskin jackets. This is George Hackney, and that's his friend John Ewing. The soldiers hated these jackets, and I don't know if this a selfie, I can't see a string there, or did he teach someone else to take it? The important thing, though, was that Hackney was allowed to take a camera to the front. Lord Kitchener had banned cameras among soldiers after the famous 1914 football match between the German and the British soldiers appeared in the Daily Express. So having discovered about George Hackney, Mark decided to write a book which became The Man Who Shot the Great War, and indeed an hour-long film for the BBC. He went to look for the images, and it was going to cost him a lot of money even to get them from official sources. But then he remembered that George Hackney, who had been a staunch Presbyterian, had become a Baha'i in later life. So what happened then was he went to the Baha'is, and the Baha'is said, "Yes, we have all his photographs in an album. Here it is." And he said, "Well, what do you want for this?" They said, "We want a copy of the book." So there's something there about photographic collection and the generosity of the Baha'is. This was taken about 3 months after that photograph. This was taken around April or May 1916. I'm not going to say too much about 1916 and the War of Independence because we will have separate presentations on those, and they're a subject all in themselves. I just want to mention here these little books that were produced at the time. I'm not sure why they were produced. Was it simply because the photographs in the paper weren't good enough, or was it for propaganda, or was it simply to make money? I think it was the last one. So this little booklet showed the destruction in Dublin after the 1916 uprising. And this is the only other image I'm going to show of the War of Independence. Again, I'm going to mention a friend's book, and I'm going to apologize in advance for mentioning friends' books. But sometimes it's easier for people like me to find images from friends that you know who are buying, who are publishing, and who are involved themselves rather than directly from institutions. It isn't always easy to find the images that you want. This was the early example of fake news in which the British Army reenacted the Battle of Tralee on the Vico Road between Dalkey and Killiney, showing dead IRA men, etc. Nobody was fooled by this at the time. And even though it appeared in the Illustrated London News and was filmed by Pathé. So here we have an example of fake news that didn't work. So we got our independence in 1922. And this image here is from the ESB archives. It shows the building of the hydroelectric scheme at Ardnacrusha in Clare on the River Shannon. It's a highly modernistic image with a man there for scale. It's a photograph that could only have been taken in the 20th century, not in the 19th century. I was talking about the Bowdyke ones also from Clare, but this is a very forward-looking, modernistic, powerful New Ireland image being created here. However, Sean Keating, I said I'd come back to painting. Sean Keating, father of Justin Keating, was a wonderful painter, and he created a wholly different image of the creation of Ardnacrusha. And he put characters in here like the priest reading his Bible, the gunman, the boss man, and a worker slugging something from a jar, which I don't think is water. But I won't say it's the same, but different. But it's a different approach and shows what painting would produce one type of image and photography could do the other one. Now, I said I would mention the Eucharistic Congress here. This is the papal legate having arrived through Dunleary for the Eucharistic Congress. Just to mention the people here are not Catholics, Eucharistic Congress is all about the Eucharist and the host, which we believe contains the body of Christ, us Catholics. There's some remarkable features in this. This chap here, who appears to be wearing 18th century dress with a wig and pantaloons, in fact, is one of the Lord Mayor's heralds that accompanied his coach at the time. And this chap here looks like a lawyer of some kind. Alfie Byrne, who did a great line in Kissing the Ring of the papal legate, was an extraordinary man, because I've also seen a photograph of him doing a funny salute with the blue shirts. Now, I have another little theme I'm going to run up here about O'Connell Bridge. Here we have, at the end of the ceremonies, there was masses over several days. There was a man's mass, a woman's mass, a children's mass, and then a general mass on the last day up in the Phoenix Park. And they say 1 million were there. And we could have done with Martin Parr there at the time. Here on O'Connell Bridge, we had cardinals, and we had priests from everywhere. And one of the reasons why I'm showing this is that I want to show O'Connell Bridge being used for being photographed for 3 different reasons. So this one here is the religious one. In Ireland, we didn't get involved in World War II. We had a thing we called the emergency. That's what my mother and father at home used to call this many years ago. They used to talk about what did he do in the emergency rather than the war. Except that one night, the war came to Dublin. It came to Dublin in the form of a bombing. Several areas in Dublin were actually bombed, including, I believe, Terenure. But the worst bombing was on the North Strand, where they dropped 500-pound bombs and 28 people died and 90 people were injured. It's just a very brief little reminder that there was a world war. We weren't involved. There are many, many pictures of soldiers training, but I think this one makes more impact. We're back to O'Connell Bridge here, and now we're using it for political reasons. The last one was for religious reasons. This photograph was taken by Larry Burrows of Life magazine. It's a wonderful photograph, I think, because he used the slow shutter speed and the people are swirling around. There were so many people there that night that the 21-gun salute, and the date was 18th of April 1949, just a few months before I was born. This had to be put back. The 3 minutes past midnight, the 21 gun salute took place. It's a wonderful picture. There's lots of little details here, including the youngster in the tree and the spirit of the people and the lights and Brave New Republic and all that. This was the night that we became a legal republic. I suppose I could pose the question, when did we become a real republic? I'm going to run a series in this called As Others Saw Us. Here, I'm showing a photograph which brings me back to a place and time. Here, if I could get all pretentious and say that Henri Cartier-Bresson was mimicking the seagulls in the background by using the nun's cornet hat as a foreground, that's pretentious. And these were part of the Daughters of Charity, sometimes irreverently mentioned as the God's geese. But the reason why I'm showing this photograph is it brings me back immediately to a place in the time. My older brother, John, if he's on, he will know that our father brought us into St. Stephen's Green often on a Sunday morning, and there was always one of these, and we called them butterfly nuns, sitting in that seat. And there's nothing like a photograph. Not 1,000 words or 1,000 paintings can bring you back to a place in time as much as a photograph. Here's another one, and I apologize for the kind of religious theme that's running through this. This is Other Sauce number 2, Dorothea Lange. We in the gallery were involved with showing her photographs of Claire a couple of years ago, just before COVID, along with Cartier-Bresson, as it turned out. This is something that will be familiar to people who went to Mass in the west of Ireland. One of the features we had within the church is that the men would sit down one side and the women and children would sit down the other side. It was almost Islamic, the division between the sexes. And then some men wouldn't even go in at all, even if it was raining, like on this day. And here they're training this young boy here to do this. This again is something that she saw, that she recorded, that strikes a chord with me, given the age that I am. Now we're going on, and I'm showing a postcard. And why am I showing a postcard? Because these are the photographs which more people saw of Ireland than probably any of the other photographs I've shown you already. They're the John Hind postcards. John Hind was an English photographer. He actually came to Ireland as a circus act. That didn't work out. So what he did then was he became a photographer that produced postcards. And in fact, he produced postcards not just of Ireland, but of many other parts of the world. One of the features about his postcards of Ireland was, and this was a remarkable thing for us, the sun was always shining. Look at the painted in sky there. And we all knew that in Ireland, the sun was not always like that. The other thing is that he had colors that we didn't know existed, like the young lady's red pullover there. Some people might regard this as a stereotype, but when I was young, I had red hair like that. Some people don't believe me, but it's a fact. And there was many kids around with red hair. And indeed, on my holidays in the west of Ireland, I saw a lot of people gathering turf using a donkey. So maybe a stereotype, but it's true. Back on O'Connell Bridge, and I promise you this is the last time we go on to O'Connell Bridge. This, of course, is the famous man on the bridge. And Abraham Feldman, known as Arthur Fields, Lithuanian Jewish extraction, born in Dublin in 1901, was there for many, many years. A lot of us will remember him as a frail old man standing on O'Connell Bridge and everybody walking by him. He took the photographs of thousands of people. Now, there were other ones there, but he is the one who lasted the longest and is therefore the most famous one. What kind of photographs did he take? Well, ones like this. This is a photograph here of this dashing young man here was actually the goalkeeper for Drumcondra and Bohemians, drums and bows as they've been known to people in Dublin. And this is a young Miss Pollock with her hat. In those days, O'Connell Street was a destination. People dressed up to go into town during the day and at night, but they didn't have cameras. They had cameras and they didn't know how to use them properly. So what happened was people would get their photograph taken by this man, and his wife would develop them under the stairs at home and then post them out to them. We're now moving into the 1960s. Now, again, I want to say, because a lot of photographers from this period on are people that I know or knew, but I just want to say that I had to make a very careful selection here. In fact, I discussed with Tanya about stopping at 1960, but I decided I would go on and show a few from the remaining part of the 20th century and into the 21st century. There's a photograph here, lovely one by Coleman Doyle, who worked for the Irish Press. It shows you the quality of the press photographers we had. This photograph to me is a mixture of the fashion photography of Richard Avedon and the street photography of Cartier-Bresson with the two urchins looking on. It's a wonderful image and typical of what our press photographers could do. And there's many, many more besides Coleman. This is one of my favorite photographs in the whole of the presentation. I'll tell you why. It was taken by a woman called Evelyn Hoffer, and this is another as others see us photograph. This is a photograph. Evelyn Hoffer was actually born in Marburg in Germany, a place I visited about 3 years ago. But she moved into the United States and then came to Ireland in the mid-1960s and took a lot of wonderful photographs. I was told today that these footballers' jerseys were knitted by some nuns, so there's a religious thing here. Well, why I can really relate to this was I never played football there, but friends of mine did, and I often went up to matches there. And up on the 15 acres at the matches at the weekend, you'll hear more wit and wisdom from the sideline than you will in the whole of O'Casey and Joyce. Or maybe what you'll hear is where O'Casey and Joyce got their wit and wisdom from. It's just a marvelous picture. And I see this being displayed in galleries all around the world. Now, photographing Ireland, I just want to stop for a minute here and just talk about, was there an Irish style of photography? A lot of people would say, well, this was taken by Bill Doyle. Now, I was at a photographic convention in Boston 2 years ago, and a guy came up to me and said, I'm a photographer from Kansas. You're from Ireland? I said, yes. I have a print by Bill Doyle on my wall in Kansas. So here's one of his Aran Island photographs showing rural Ireland, old Ireland, as it were. Is there an Irish style of photography? I think probably there isn't, but one of the things about the Irish photographers, particularly people like Bill Doyle, is they weren't as much in your face and they were more sympathetic, as it were, to their subject matter than were, let's say, photographers in New York and places like that. And while Bill was taking photographs of old Ireland, he was also taking photographs of young Ireland. This young man is probably in his late 60s now. And maybe this was set up. He's looking back. He's in all his finery and he's looking back at the girl in the miniskirt. But it just shows you that at the time, photographers were recording the Ireland that had been and the Ireland that was about to come. Unfortunately, from the 1960s and 1990s, we had the troubles in Northern Ireland. This photograph here, which was taken by Stanley Matchett, who I had the pleasure to meet at the launch of a book called Shooting the Darkness, which was also a BBC film. He took a series of photographs of people carrying away young Jackie Duddy. He was either dead or about to die. He was only 17 years old. He was one of 14 people who were shot dead by the paratroopers, British paratroopers in Derry in 1972. This is Father Edward Daly. And this is the photograph that went around the world, waving a blood-stained handkerchief as a sign of peace to bring his body, the young man's, either his body or himself, through the army barricades. Now, this photograph is actually made by the army man being there, faceless, looking away, and also by this man looking at him. It's a remarkable photograph. It's the only one I'm going to show from the Troubles. It's many ways. It's for a lot of people, it's still a very raw experience. I was talking earlier about street photography. It's not a term I like because I think I regard it as people in an environment photography, because you can do similar photography of people standing in a field in rural Ireland or people sitting in a building, the same type. One particular photographer here, Tony O'Shea, a lot of people listening in will know him, actually made the tops of Dublin buses his street. And on one occasion, he met this young man here with a kestrel and a glove, and his pal here looking back. And it's a bit like the 15 acres as well. If you want to hear wit and wisdom, go onto the top deck of a Dublin bus. A little bit about digital photography and smartphones. Digital photography has meant a lot more photography, perhaps better image quality, but whether the pictures themselves are actually better is debatable. There's an awful lot more of them. And that leads to issues about photography. Is it, for example, if it's being produced for social media, it's here today, gone tomorrow. How do we preserve it for the future? There are people who also say that paper images will last longer than digital images because systems change. This is a photograph not taken in Ireland, but taken by an Irish photographer, Brendan O'Shea, who does smartphone lessons for the gallery photography. And one of the things about the smartphone is the smartphone isn't just a camera. There's new paradigms here. It's a communications device. So your auntie in Australia can see the photographs of your wedding a couple of minutes after they were taken. Now to the last two images. This one I call New Ireland. And the reason I call New Ireland is that the photographer here, Dragana Jurisic, was not born in Ireland. She's born in Croatia. And we have a lot of photographers here who are from outside Ireland who are producing wonderful work. This photograph may mystify some people, and I shouldn't really try to explain it. Dragana should be here to explain her image. There was Vermeer and the Masters of the Genre exhibition in the National Gallery. Following that, they had 3 commissions to artists to produce after Vermeer. And this is what Dragana produced. However, Dragana's image here is not based on so much on Vermeer as it is a Tarantic dance in The Doll's House by Heinrich Ibsen. So there are layers of intellectual meaning in this, and I probably shouldn't have tried to say all that. I should have left it to Dragana. So here's my final image. The reason why I chose this to be the final image is that I want to go back to Maria Edgeworth. Remember the thing that I showed you at the beginning. This is an image by Mandy O'Neill. Now, Mandy is an excellent photographer. This was taken as part of a commission which he got as an artist in residence at a Dublin school. And this image of hers was shown in our gallery. But before that, it won the Zurich Prize, the National Portrait Prize, sponsored by Zurich, at the National Gallery. But in that competition, and I want to go back to Della Roche as well as Maria Edgeworth, there were paintings. So it was multimedia, as it were. And so paintings were competing with photographs. So whatever you might think about photographic judging or curation, we still have, painting is still alive 182 years later. As it turns out, the painting which came runner-up to this photograph was actually a painting of a friend of mine and his wife, done by their son. So I just want to say just a few words to wrap up before we start into questions. I've shown a lot of photographic history here. What I've also shown is they've come from different collections. I haven't been able to say like which collections they've come from here because we'd been here all night as I listed them out. However, it's very important that we preserve our visual history. To my mind, our visual history is a public good. It belongs to the people. Because if we don't know who we were, it's very hard to figure out who we are. So there's a lot of people involved in this. And I want to, yet again, encourage people in local history groups, camera clubs, and heritage groups to reach out to the institutions with what you may have at home. You may have a piece of photographic history at home and you don't know this. As for the institutions themselves, we ourselves are about to start our own national collection, which will be of more contemporary photographers. And then there's the National Photographic Archive in the NLI who do marvelous work. There's the National Gallery who do marvelous work. There's the National Museum. There's local history museums, people all around the country. I do think something more could be done to make it easier for people to access and find their photographic history. A lot has been done, but there's a lot more to do. So thanks for listening, and we'll take questions. Will I stop? Yeah, okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much, William. You're fantastic as ever. So kind of enthusiastic and knowledgeable and weaving in and out of interesting stories. We have actually just a few direct questions. I'm not sure we're going to have a lot of time to really do them justice, though. Here's one just come in from Henry Joy McCracken, I'm sure.
In Paris.
Lovely talk. One first question for William. There weren't so many photographs of ordinary people in environment like cortege and Atget in Dublin in the 20s and 30s from close up. Is that true that these kinds of photographs were not being taken in Ireland?
I haven't seen too many of them like Cortez and Atget, or indeed as Cartier-Bresson. Where I see the explosion is actually from World War II onwards. Not that many people in Dublin had cameras, and those who had cameras, as I said, the most photographed event in the 1930s was in fact the Eucharistic Congress. And
actually, there is also an interesting factoid, is that Father Brown, who would maybe have been that.
I chose.
But the one thing he did, there is no Father Brown photograph of the interior of a pub because he didn't go to them.
No, Lee Miller took one, showed the interior of a pub when she took the photographs just after World War II, showing the route that Leopold Bloom took on Bloomsday in Ulysses. And that is one of the earlier photographs of the inside of an Irish pub. There's plenty from the 1950s onwards, certainly.
Indeed, yes.
No, Henry Joy is something about astronomers. There, I know Henry Joy McCracken is actually he's not a historical figure. He's actually an Irish astronomer working in Paris, and he and I have been in particularly about the grubs, have been in communication for a long time.
Indeed, yes, because also then that the Dublin Photographic Society there that you mentioned, that also must have been the Grub daughter was one of their founding members. So
Mary Grub, I think Mary was her name. She was the secretary. She took the notes.
We don't have like that now. Not having that.
No, she was. But Mary Ross was a member. They'd be afraid of her. Because
I should say there are lots of lovely comments coming in congratulating you, William. Perhaps actually this is the time for us all perhaps to give you a round of applause. So thank you very much indeed. And maybe we just unmute and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. I just see a friend of mine.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Thanks very much. I see Dunk is there from Peterborough. He's a good friend of mine from across the water, and they are Dunk waving at me there. So.
Right, very good. Well, thank you all, everybody, for coming. I should just say we are going to be taking up some of the call to action that Willie was pointing to there. Tomorrow, my colleague Trish Lamb and myself will be talking, giving a different kind of Zoom presentation here about really looking at the value and how to look after your own family photograph collections. And I'm always amazed at how, without a doubt, when people talk about if they ever had the things that really matter to them, if they have to run out of a burning house, the things you miss are your photographs. And we of course are very proud of the collections and the national collections in large institutions and giving us a sense of our history and so on. But as individuals, we also have this in our own family albums, and just with a little bit of kind of knowledge and care and everything, we can look after them so much better, I think. So that's going to happen tomorrow. But as I say, for the meantime, I think we better hold it here. We're going way over time. So thank you very much indeed.
Just one last thing. If people want to leave comments on the YouTube this is available on YouTube. I'd be quite happy to answer their comments there on YouTube. If people have questions to ask, if they watch it on YouTube. So thank you.